A few days ago, something extraordinary happened. The leader of a sovereign nation, a man who controlled the world's largest oil reserves, who defied the United States for over a decade, who had survived assassination attempts, coups, and international arrest warrants, was captured. Not by tanks, not by an invasion, but by something far more devastating: a spreadsheet. Nicolás Maduro is now in US custody, and if you think that happened because of good intelligence or special forces alone, you're missing the real story. This arrest was 12 years in the making, and the weapon wasn't military, it was financial. By the end of this video, you'll understand how the US dismantled an entire country's economy without firing a shot, how they turned oil, the thing that made Venezuela rich, into the very thing that destroyed it, and why this matters for every single country watching right now. Because here's the thing nobody's talking about. If they can do it to Venezuela, they can do it to anyone. Stick around until the end because I'm going to show you the one financial move Venezuela could have made that would have prevented all of this. It's so obvious in hindsight, it's almost painful. Let's rewind to when Venezuela was actually kinda killing it. Early 2000s, Venezuela is sitting on 303 billion barrels of proven oil reserves. That's more than Saudi Arabia, more than Russia, more than Canada. They literally had more oil than they knew what to do with. And oil prices through the roof. Money was pouring in faster than the government could spend it, which, spoiler alert, they took as a personal challenge. Here's how good things were. Venezuela was importing food instead of growing it. Why bother with boring stuff like agriculture when you can just buy everything with oil money? It's like winning the lottery and immediately canceling your gym membership because you can now afford liposuction. Short-term thinking, sure, but when oil is $100 a barrel, who cares? Then came Hugo Chavez. Love him or hate him, and trust me, there's no middle ground. The man had timing. He nationalized the oil industry, kicked out foreign companies, put the government in charge of basically everything, and it worked, at least for a while. Why? Because oil prices kept climbing. When you're printing money from oil, socialist economics looks genius. It's easy to be generous when the checks don't bounce. Poverty fell. Government programs expanded. Chavez became a folk hero to his supporters and a boogeyman to Washington. But here's what Venezuela didn't do during this golden age: build anything else. No manufacturing base, no agricultural development, no diversified exports, no plan B. The entire economy was a one-legged stool labeled oil, and everyone just sat on it, confidently. Then Chavez died in 2013 and Nicolás Maduro inherited the throne. Except Maduro didn't inherit Chavez's charisma, his political instincts, or his luck. What he did inherit was an economy held together by duct tape and high oil prices. And then oil prices collapsed. Suddenly, that one-legged stool, yeah, it broke. Revenue vanished overnight. The government had a choice: restructure the economy, cut spending, attract foreign investment, maybe admit some mistakes, boring adult stuff. Instead, they chose the economic equivalent of fake it till you make it. They turned on the money printer. And they didn't just turn it on, they welded the off switch in the trash and let it run 24/7. Here's a fun economics lesson. When you print money without producing anything of value, you don't get richer, you just get more colorful paper. The Bolivar, Venezuela's currency, went from money to decorative confetti faster than you can say hyperinflation. How bad did it get? People stopped counting cash, they weighed it. You needed a wheelbarrow of bolivars to buy a loaf of bread. Savings accounts became a practical joke. A cup of coffee in the morning cost one price. By afternoon, it cost double. This wasn't theory from an economics textbook. This was Tuesday. Inflation hit 130,060% in 2018. Let me put that in perspective. If you saved $1,000 in January, by December it was worth about 77 cents. Your retirement fund? Congratulations, you now can buy a pack of gum. Imports became impossible, shelves emptied, medicine disappeared. Millions of Venezuelans fled the country in one of the largest migration crises in modern history. The GDP, the total value of everything the country produced, shrank by 75%. 3/4 of the economy just evaporated. Venezuela went from South America's richest nation to a failed state in less than a decade. That's not a recession, that's not even a depression, that's economic annihilation. And that's when the United States saw an opportunity.
Now here's where it gets interesting, and stay with me because this is where the real lesson is. The US didn't need to send troops to finish off Venezuela. They had something far more powerful, access to the global financial system. And they were about to show Maduro what happens when you lose that access. The next part explains exactly how they cut off Venezuela's oxygen supply, dollar by dollar. And trust me, it's brutal.
Here's what most people don't understand about modern power. You don't need aircraft carriers anymore. You need bank accounts. The United States began systematically cutting Venezuela off from the global financial system. Not all at once, that would be too obvious. Slowly, methodically, like a financial anaconda. First, sanctions on individuals, then Venezuelan banks, then the state oil company, PDVSA, then shipping networks, then secondary sanctions, meaning even countries that wanted to buy Venezuelan oil faced legal risks if they used US dollars or banks. Let me explain why this is devastating. Oil isn't like selling lemonade on the corner. You can't just hand someone a barrel and take cash. Oil is traded in US dollars through international banks with complex financing and insurance. When the US blocks your access to that system, you can have all the oil in the world and it's worthless. Venezuela couldn't sell oil easily. They couldn't import essentials. They couldn't access billions of dollars in frozen assets sitting in foreign banks. International transactions that once took minutes became impossible. And here's the genius, or the cruelty depending on your perspective. Sanctions didn't cause Venezuela's collapse. That collapse was already happening because of mismanagement and money printing, but sanctions accelerated it and locked it in place. They turned a domestic crisis into an international chokehold. By 2019, Venezuela's oil exports had fallen by 90%. The GDP had shrunk by 3/4. The government was surviving on scraps, informal trade networks, and support from Russia, China, and Iran, none of whom were willing to risk serious US sanctions to save Maduro. Then, in March 2020, the US indicted Nicolás Maduro on narco-terrorism charges. They put a $15 million bounty on his head, later increased to $50 million. This wasn't just symbolic. This was the US saying, we're no longer treating you as a head of state. You're a criminal, and we're coming for you. And Maduro? He survived. For years. He controlled the military. He controlled what was left of the oil revenue. He played allies against each other. The regime was weak, but it was alive, until a few days ago.
On January 3, 2026, US authorities captured Nicolás Maduro. The details are still emerging, but the fact is undeniable. The man is in US custody facing American courts. The world is still reacting. Some governments are outraged, calling it a violation of sovereignty. Others are quietly relieved. Markets are watching nervously. But here's what matters from a financial perspective. This capture wasn't a surprise. It was inevitable. By the time Maduro was arrested, Venezuela was already financially dead. Oil revenues were a fraction of their peak. Foreign assets were frozen. The state's balance sheet was a smoking crater. The government couldn't pay its military reliably. It couldn't import food. It couldn't stabilize prices. It was a zombie regime, technically alive, but functionally finished. This is the part everyone misses. Modern power doesn't collapse dramatically, it erodes. When governments lose access to capital, they lose the ability to govern. Authority becomes expensive, loyalty becomes transactional, and when you can't pay the people with guns, you're not in power, you're in danger. Financial pressure doesn't topple regimes overnight, it makes them brittle, and eventually they crack. Venezuela became a case study in what happens when a country loses access to the global financial system. Every vulnerability was exposed, every mistake was magnified, every escape route was closed. And here's the uncomfortable truth. The physical arrest was only possible after years of economic destruction. You can't capture a well-funded, internationally connected leader easily, but a broke dictator clinging to power in an isolated, collapsed state? That's a different story. So what's the lesson here? And more importantly, could Venezuela have avoided this? Yes, absolutely yes, and it's so painfully obvious you'll wonder how they missed it. Diversify. That's it, that's the whole answer. If Venezuela had spent even a fraction of its oil wealth building other industries, manufacturing, agriculture, technology, tourism, it wouldn't have been so vulnerable. If it had maintained institutional trust instead of seizing private companies, foreign capital would have stayed. If it had saved money during the boom years instead of spending everything, it would have had a cushion during the bust. But here's the thing about oil wealth. It makes you lazy.
It makes you think the good times will last forever. It makes you believe you don't need boring things like economic fundamentals or diversification strategies. Why plant crops when you can buy food? Why build factories when you can import everything? Because eventually the oil money runs out, or the oil price crashes, or, and this is key, someone cuts off your access to selling it. Venezuela didn't collapse because of one decision or one leader. It collapsed because a fragile economic model met political mismanagement, hyperinflation, external pressure, and financial isolation all at once. It's like building a house out of matchsticks during a drought and then acting surprised when lightning strikes. And here's why this story matters beyond Venezuela. In the modern world, financial systems are weapons. Control over currencies, trade routes, and payment networks determines outcomes long before soldiers appear. Wars don't begin with invasions anymore. They begin with banking restrictions, with frozen accounts, with sanctions that turn off revenue streams one by one. The battlefield isn't a border. It's SWIFT codes and central bank reserves and correspondent banking relationships. It's access to dollars and euros. It's who controls the rails that money runs on. Venezuela learned this the hard way. You can have all the oil in the world, but if you can't sell it, you have nothing. You can be a sovereign nation, but if you're locked out of global finance, your sovereignty is theoretical. And whether you see Maduro's capture as justice, intervention, or economic warfare, it proves one thing clearly. In the 21st century, the most powerful weapons aren't missiles, they're markets.
So here we are, a few days after a head of state was captured, and the world is still processing what it means. But from a financial perspective, the story isn't complicated.
Venezuela was rich, then it was reckless, then it was broke, then it was isolated.
Then the leader was captured.
Leaders don't always fall from coups or tanks. Sometimes they fall from balance sheets. Sometimes they fall because the numbers stop working. And sometimes, after 12 years of financial pressure, they fall into custody. That's how you bankrupt a nation. And that's why every government on Earth is watching this story very, very carefully. Because if it happened to Venezuela, it could happen to them. Thanks for watching. If this changed how you think about money and power, hit that like button. Subscribe for more breakdowns of how the world actually works. And drop a comment. Do you think financial warfare is the future of conflict? Or did Venezuela just make every possible mistake? See you in the next one.